Venezuela, Irán y Groenlandia, 3 países distantes, coinciden en la convulsa situación internacional. Jake Sotiriadis, experto en política exterior y exoficial de inteligencia de la Fuerza Aérea de Estados Unidos, analiza la estrategia del presidente Trump y los mensajes que envía a nivel internacional.
What does Maduro's arrest mean for Venezuela and the broader region of Latin America?
Look, this was the most significant projection of American military power in the Western Hemisphere since Panama in 1989. And I think it really demonstrated two things simultaneously. First, that the United States possesses unmatched operational capability. Delta Force extracted a sitting head of state from a fortified military compound in under 3 hours with 0 American fatalities. No other military on earth can do that. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated political will. President Trump's shown that he's willing to use hard power decisively, but smartly. Surgical strikes rather than protracted land wars, which is a significant message to every leader that's watching.
Let's change continent. We are moving to the Middle East. Iran is in turmoil. Do you think that the regime will change?
Iran is a particularly complex situation because the protests already have killed, or the regime has killed about 2,000 protesters. President Trump has threatened military action if this crackdown continues. At the same time, Iran does have retaliatory capability in terms of striking at U.S. bases in the region. They also could look at closing the Strait of Hormuz. But of course, their proxy network is severely weakened after the military campaigns of 2025. So I would say that at this point, it looks like the Iranian regime is cornered without many good options.
I would like to ask you about Greenland. Why is this country becoming a critical geopolitical point for the US, Russia, and China right now?
It basically controls access to the Arctic and the North American continent. And so that geographic position is strategic for American security interests, which is why the US have a military base there, and they've had it since the Second World War. The second reason is critical resources, so rare earth minerals that are on Greenland. Those are critical for everything from smartphones to batteries for electric vehicles to military hardware. And so China right now controls that market, and the United States is looking to Greenland as a source of additional rare earth minerals to try to change that equation. And then, of course, the third issue is the great power competition. Russia has become much more active in Greenland. And of course, China has also called itself a near Arctic nation. And so for all of those reasons, the United States realizes whoever controls Greenland is going to not only control the resources, but also the geographic access for its strategic interests in the future.
Italia y Japón han reforzado su asociación estratégica con especial atención a la seguridad en el Indo-Pacífico. La primera ministra italiana, Giorgia Meloni, se reunió con su homóloga japonesa con motivo del 160 aniversario de las relaciones diplomáticas entre Roma y Tokio. La tercera visita de Meloni a Japón tuvo como objetivo elevar las relaciones bilaterales a una asociación estratégica especial en respuesta a un escenario global caracterizado por la inestabilidad. La defensa y la innovación industrial estuvieron en el centro de las conversaciones. Ambas líderes reconocieron los avances del programa aéreo de combate global, el proyecto de caza de nueva generación desarrollado conjuntamente con el Reino Unido. También reiteraron su condena a los programas nucleares de Corea del Norte y expresaron su preocupación por su cooperación militar con Rusia.
The region is holding its collective breath, hoping cooler heads will prevail and that escalating rhetoric will not lead to open conflict. Earlier this week, Iran warned Qatar and Saudi Arabia that if it is attacked, it will retaliate by striking American targets in those countries. And to explain what's at stake for the region, I'm joined on Euronews by Mehran Kamrava, a leading expert on Middle Eastern politics. Professor, can you explain the mechanics of what's driving the current standoff?
If the Americans were to attack targets inside Iran, then politically the Iranian government simply cannot afford not to react. It cannot bear the political costs domestically of looking as if it is incapable of hitting back. And therefore, it will have to retaliate in one form or another. This is precisely what we saw in 2020 when the Americans assassinated General Soleimani. And this is what we saw in June of 2025 when the Israelis and the Americans attacked Iran and the United States attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. And so in both of those instances, we saw Iranian retaliation. And there's no reason to believe that this time would be any different. If anything, the Iranians this time would want to certainly show that they can throw a much more lethal punch.
And could you explain how any miscalculation now could have serious consequences well beyond Iran and the United States, especially for countries hosting American forces?
Well, in circumstances like this, rhetoric tends to take a life of its own, and it becomes extremely difficult for political actors to dial it down. But I think a sober assessment of the consequences of the day after is what is needed. And so long as those voices of reason appear, and they have the day, they can carry the day, then I think what we're likely to see is kind of a dialing down of tensions. I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind, if I may just elaborate. A few days ago, everybody thought that the Iranian government was on the verge of collapse, that the Islamic Republic was a spent force, and it was only a matter of days before it tips over. And now what we see is that once again, we were too hasty in writing the obituary of the Islamic Republic.
And turning to the situation inside Iran itself, what's your assessment of what's happening on the ground right now amid widespread protests and a heavy security response?
By all accounts, what we hear is that pro-government protesters now by far outnumber anti-government protesters. Now, I think it's important to remember that in order to be more secure, anti-government protesters come out under the cover of night. And so it's in the evenings, and with the shutdown of the internet, it is extremely difficult for us to accurately assess how widespread those protests are. Regardless of the size of the protests, what we see is that anti-government sentiments, anger, popular anger, is extremely widespread across the country.
For now, Gulf states are watching closely and urging restraint from both Washington and Tehran. Adel Halim, Euronews, Doha.
Is Ursula von der Leyen also increasing her own salary? A video recently shared on Instagram claims that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is automatically increasing her own salary. The claim has resurfaced on social media after being relayed by far-right political figures, including former MEP Florian Philippot, who quoted an article published by the German newspaper Bild. In an article from March 2025, Bild reports that EU officials have received their 7th pay raise in 3 years. According to publicly available data published by Eurlex, it is true that the salaries of EU officials increased between 2020 and 2025. But these increases are not the result of a personal decision by Ursula von der Leyen. They are based on an automatic salary adjustment mechanism adopted in 2013 by the European Parliament and EU member states. EU staff salaries are updated annually using a formula calculated by Eurostat. This formula reflects changes in the purchasing power of national civil servants across EU countries. For example, if the Belgian government increases or decreases the purchasing power of its civil servants, the salaries of EU officials working in Belgium follow the same trend. Looking specifically at Ursula von der Leyen's salary, it is accurate to say that her monthly salary rose from around €28,400 in 2020 to approximately €35,800 today. Another claim often heard is that EU officials do not pay taxes. This is partly misleading. EU officials do not pay national income tax, but they are subject to EU taxes. A Commission spokesperson told The Cube that it has absolutely no such thing as self-raising salaries. It added that administrative savings between 2004 and 2025 led to an 11.9% drop in EU staff's real purchasing power due to staff regulation reforms and salary adjustment cuts.
¿Qué opinan los europeos sobre el uso de la IA en la educación? Más de la mitad de los encuestados de la UE cree que la IA puede aportar beneficios y riesgos a la enseñanza y al aprendizaje y que la comunidad educativa debería evaluar y explorar ambos aspectos. El apoyo es mayor entre los encuestados finlandeses y estonios. Los hombres son más propensos que las mujeres a creer que la IA puede mejorar la enseñanza y el aprendizaje, y que la comunidad educativa no debe tener miedo a experimentar con ella. Los encuestados más jóvenes de entre 15 y 24 años también son más propensos que los grupos de más edad a estar de acuerdo con esta afirmación. Aproximadamente 8 de cada 10 encuestados están muy de acuerdo o bastante de acuerdo con que todos los profesores deberían estar equipados con las habilidades necesarias para utilizar y comprender la IA. Los encuestados de Chipre y Malta son los que más apoyan esta opinión, mientras que solo el 24% de los checos están totalmente de acuerdo con ella. Aproximadamente 4 de cada 10 encuestados afirman que las escuelas y universidades deberían tener directrices claras sobre cómo y cuándo utilizar la IA y que se debería ayudar a los profesores a saber cómo y cuándo utilizar este tipo de herramientas. A pesar de la apertura a la introducción de la IA en la educación, el 69% de los encuestados está de acuerdo en que los dispositivos digitales personales como los teléfonos inteligentes deberían estar prohibidos en las escuelas. Esta opinión coincide con las decisiones tomadas en los últimos años por algunos países europeos que han introducido medidas para eliminar los teléfonos de los colegios. Al menos 12 países de la UE han adoptado algún tipo de restricción sobre los teléfonos inteligentes en los centros educativos, mientras que otros 4 lo están considerando.